Good morning, everybody. We have, I'll go very quickly because we just want to give the panelists a lot of time to talk. We have a wonderful group of panelists today. Let me first introduce Susan Gray, who is runs the business practice in infrastructure at Standard & Poor's, headquartered here in the city, but with obviously global responsibilities for evaluating and rating and assessing projects all over the world. Our second panelist is Jane Garvey, who is the chairman and leader of Meridiam, an infrastructure advisory firm, and Jane is also on the board of directors of United Airlines and is obviously intimately involved in the infrastructure as relates to aviation and all other sorts of things. And lastly, we're lucky to have Rick Cotton here today. Rick is the chief executive officer, leader of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a small job that is involved in a few infrastructure projects here in town. So let's welcome all the panelists if you can. Let me get right to it, guys. Maybe starting with you, Rick, quickly. What are you working on, which is sort of a crazy thing, but what are you working on? How's it going? And what can you tell us about all the projects?
Well, thank you, Alan. I guess I would start at the obvious place, which is at the top of our agenda are the major infrastructure construction projects that are currently underway. Leading that list is the $8 billion rebuilding of LaGuardia Airport. It will be the first brand new airport built in the United States in the last 20 years. We have a similar ambition with respect to John F. Kennedy Airport. Both of those are very high on Governor Cuomo's $100 billion infrastructure agenda. For those of you who may have used LaGuardia, you actually can see steel rising, the outlines of the first gates, and that project is moving forward at a rapid clip. With respect to Kennedy Airport, we're still in the planning phase, but that will be moving into the deal and construction phase as rapidly as we can. We have announced, and there will be a groundbreaking in the near future on a $2.7 billion brand new terminal at Newark, and I think that's the first time in a long time that one can say that there's that amount of activities in terms of rebuilding the infrastructure of our airports. So we're also focused on a new bus terminal. We're focused on airport access projects, AirTrain to LaGuardia, trying to identify a way to get a one-seat ride to Kennedy and a path to Newark alternative. So the top of our agenda are those construction projects, heavily focused also on security, doing a top-to-bottom review on that, heavily focused on customer service. That has not, in the past, been a high enough priority at the Port Authority, and we are also focused on improving the sustainability of the Port Authority's activities. So we're pushing ahead on all of those. All of them are a heavy lift, but it is in the nature of that today. Finally, in terms of this conference, I would say we are heavily, heavily focused on global best practices so that we benchmark everything that we do against best in class globally and aspire to that standard. And finally, 21st century technology. And government agencies, I think big organizations of all types struggle in terms of keeping up with the pace of change. But those two are really front and center in terms of global best practice and 21st century technology.
Rick, thanks. Jane, what would you say?
Well, first of all, I'm surprised you didn't ask Rick what he does in his spare time.
Right, no, it's...
For us, as Rick said, LaGuardia is a big project. It's the biggest one we're doing. We're very excited about it. And I think what's always interesting when you think about the terminal, it's not just a terminal. There are, by the way, 8 miles of roadway that's involved in this reconstruction. There's also about 20 bridges. So it's a mammoth undertaking. And the interesting part, of course, for those of you who travel in and out of LaGuardia, is that we have to build it while we're keeping the existing terminal operating. So the challenge of doing that, keeping an existing terminal operating, keeping the airlines functioning, running, I didn't say on time, but I did say still doing what they do, and at the same time building a new terminal is without a doubt extremely complex. But in addition to LaGuardia, for the firm that I'm with, we're also involved in a number of projects that have an impact on cities. A tunnel in Miami, we've got a rail project in Maryland, the Purple Line, and we have the Long Beach Courthouse in California, and the Presidio Parkway, which is building a road through one of the most environmentally sensitive parks in the United States. So again, very much like Rick and the Port Authority, we put a huge emphasis on some of the ESG issues. We put a huge emphasis on the climate impacts of the work that we do. That's really a core of what we do. Exciting work. It doesn't get much more exciting than that.
So I raise your hand if you landed in LaGuardia recently. So
Don't
about a
turn on
third
us
of you,
now.
right? So I must say, I said this to both Jane and Rick a few seconds ago. I landed yesterday, and it actually starting to look like an airport. I mean, the front part, the new part, is actually, it has the sort of indicia of an airport. So I want to congratulate you both for the progress you made so far.
So, Alan, I appreciate that, but I will say that the LaGuardia project, in terms of the actual start of construction, was announced 2 years ago.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And it is only now, when literally the steel is 4 floors out of the ground, if you come in on the air side, you can actually see the built gates as they will start to be. It's only then when New Yorkers, forgive me, actually say, oh, you mean it's actually going to get built? Because nobody believes what a government agency says when it says we're going to do something.
Well, we're going to come back to that in a minute, and that leads right into Susan, who is sort of responsible in many ways for at least coming up with some sign of reality when a project is announced, because she's got to put a rating on it. So how can you help these guys?
Well, it's great to be here at this really important conference. So we have a team of 135 analysts around the world in 20 countries who look at infrastructure transactions and private infrastructure transactions and assess the creditworthiness of these transactions, because our role is to provide transparency to investors in the capital markets and private debt markets. And so we go through these transactions in enormous detail. We've probably looked at 2,300 or thereabouts over the last 25 years. And I think one of the very interesting things at the moment is when we're looking at infrastructure, we're also cognizant of the fact that there's a huge amount of technological change that's going on. There's a huge amount of disruption. We're seeing it, every day around us. So one of the key issues, which may not necessarily today impact on creditworthiness, but you can see it evolving over time, is what is our future infrastructure looking like, and how is it going to change? And in terms of cities, because infrastructure provides such a critical economic driver to cities. I mean, infrastructure allows cities to actually lead at a different pace if they've got strong and competent infrastructure. So these decisions that we're making today about our infrastructure are decisions we're going to be living with for 50, 60, 70 years. And that's a key area of focus for us at the moment.
So when we had our pre-conference, the 4 of us chatted the other day in talking about this, the panelists kept coming back to, I guess, the word champion, the need for a champion. And I think the need for a sponsor/champion leader is even more important when you're building in built environments, in infill environments. New York City, the Presidio, these kinds of environments. Could you, 3 of you, comment about your view of a champion? City, sponsor, government, private sector, the community. How do you get a champion, and who have been the champions of the projects you guys are working on now? Rick, do you want to start?
Well, for me, the answer is actually very, very easy and very key, which is Governor Cuomo in New York State has been, I think, probably the national champion of an infrastructure program. So, Alan, I guess I take a step back in terms of talking about a champion, which is an elected official prepared to take on the challenges of infrastructure projects, which include funding. It includes striking the right balance between the impact of an infrastructure project on a community where the benefits generally accrue to a broader community, but the local community bears the brunt of the impact of construction. And then secondly, the private sector, I just like to comment a little bit within the world of champion, but also of credibility. So the challenge of getting infrastructure projects funded and built in today's world is enormously hard, and you have to accept that and be prepared to engage with that. And there's often a disconnect, if you're talking about an elected official, between the point in time when they have to champion a project and actually the period of time when credit is going to be distributed, because infrastructure projects are multi-year projects. So it is critical. You need to identify the funding. Inevitably, that is some sort of governmental process, and it needs a champion for that. It needs a champion in terms of all of the permitting processes that you need to go through. And infrastructure projects tend to, in my view, get divided into two phases. One is the pre-construction phase, and the second is the construction phase, and both are very difficult. And you really need a champion for the pre-construction phase: funding, permitting, dealing with the local community and striking the right balance. And that, in my experience, tends to be an elected leader or multiple elected leaders who see the benefits and are prepared to stand up and advocate the fact that inconvenience during the construction project and figuring out benefits for the communities needs to be outweighed by the broader good. The help that the private sector, and we wind up talking about public-private partnerships, are very, very important. In fact, as Jane has commented, she and two other partners are the private public-private sponsor of the LaGuardia project. They are responsible for the construction and then ultimately long-term for the operation and maintenance of that terminal. Government does not do construction well. Government does not really have as its expertise operating a whole variety of actual customer-oriented operations. So having the private sector expertise becomes critical in terms of actually having the credibility, A, that it will get built, and B, that it will be operated smartly. But the role, and we can talk more about it, but the public agency cannot back away and simply hand the keys to the project to the private sponsor. It has to set performance specifications, and it has to be aggressive in cooperation with its partner to be sure that the performance specifications, which in an airport, for example, or bus terminal, are very, very complicated, that the private operator is living up to the performance specifications. But having the involvement of the private sector, the support of a private sponsor, where you can make the case to the public, it will get built well, and it will be operated well, because it'll draw on the private sector expertise of entities that do it for a living.
So Jane, you mentioned the Presidio, you mentioned Long Beach, you mentioned the Miami project, as well as LaGuardia. Beyond government and beyond your own company, who are the champions that you want to get involved?
Yeah, I think, as Rick points out, because of the length of these projects, it often will go across administrations. So there needs to be other parties that are deeply committed to it. One thing we look at is the criticality of a project. We are not likely at Meridiam, for example, to take on a football stadium, which may be the favorite project of a mayor, but may not be favored by the next administration. But if you find a project that is absolutely critical to the infrastructure of a community, like a LaGuardia, like a Presidio Parkway, Long Beach Courthouse, the chances of finding the outside community supporters who will be there beyond any administration very much exist. So we often look to the business community or to the environmental community or to active community leaders who also join with the elected official. It is a very gutsy thing for an elected official to go out on a limb on these projects, particularly because of the length of them and the challenges and the reality that they may be gone when the ribbon is finally cut. So they do need that support as well. And I think in all of the projects that we've been involved in that I would consider successful, there has been an active community base, whether it's the business community, environmental community, or others. So I think that's critical and important as well. There's a near-death experience with at least twice on any of these big projects.
Exactly.
And you need that support.
And as you rate a project, Susan, as your team goes out around the world and rates these projects, what do you look for in champions, in sponsorship?
Well,
And what are you terrified about?
well, one of the key benefits of a public-private partnership is that when the transaction is put together, it looks at the whole life cycle of the project. So it actually looks at operation and maintenance over the long term. It looks at construction, what can go wrong with construction, is there enough capital to support it, and these are all the things that we look at in a lot of detail. And I think one of the critical things is that when you see that a project has good alignment, it is much more likely to get to financial close. And that's been the experience over the last decade in the US in a very significant way. So the champion that we've been talking about is really someone who actually not just talks about the benefits of the project in terms of the construction of the asset, but actually is someone who's able to say, we are actually putting in place a long-term plan for how this asset is going to be essentially afforded by the community over 30 or 40 years. And one of the issues that we've got, one of the reasons why we've got the infrastructure financing gap in this country today is because a lot of the procurement of infrastructure has been with a much more short-term time frame in mind. So around the country, we have infrastructure where we don't actually have enough capital to maintain it or expand it. So that tends to be a much more robust construct from a financing perspective.
And is it different
things we look at
globally, outside the United States?
It's different in the sense that outside the United States, you haven't had probably quite the same emphasis on states and municipalities financing infrastructure as you have here. You haven't had quite the same emphasis on well, you don't have tax-exempt financing outside the US. So I think other countries have probably been put into a situation where they've had to find alternative solutions faster. And that's the point we're at today, where we're really trying to work out what is the American model and how do we make it work.
So any further things on this, or let me move on to the next topic that I wanted to cover, which is, here in New York, we've had some great successes. I guess the new bridge, the Tappan Zee, the Cuomo Bridge, that's just finishing sort of on time and on budget. All the way on the other end of that is the East Side Access Project, which has been a very, very significant overrun in terms of plans. Which brings me to the question of reporting and transparency. Reporting to your colleagues in government, you're reporting to the business community, reporting to your financial sponsors and partners, as well as the public. Rick, do you have any views on how often, the type of reporting, these projects ought to have as you think about it?
Well, a public agency, almost by definition, has reporting to the extent that we have private sponsors. They themselves have reporting. We try to publish every quarter an update on our capital plan in terms of how capital plan projects are going. So it's obviously, if you're going to build confidence, and I think that what I would say the enormous and required benefit of transparency is that I always think of it in terms of the phrase good enough for government work. How many of you have used that phrase? Think about what that says. What it says is, you know that government work is going to be subpar, it's going to be slow, it's not going to meet normal standards. I think it's critical that agencies recognize that they have to overcome that. Projects need to overcome that. And the only way that I know how to do it is to try to be transparent, try to be clear that the agency has that in mind, is employing techniques in terms of how projects are managed, and then reporting in terms of how those are going. I think the Tappan Zee Bridge, the Mario Cuomo Bridge, good example of that. That is on time and on budget, driven through the application process, driven through the construction project. Next week, the Port Authority will be completing a bridge that goes between Staten Island and New Jersey. And again, that is on time and on budget. And so, and that was a public-private partnership. And again, so that I believe the techniques, which sound a little nerdy, but design, build, and putting the responsibility on the private sector, even longer term in terms of operation and maintenance, is a way to both give people confidence, but also pull a partner in, which almost by definition improves the transparency.
Sure.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is early and often in terms of communication and reporting. And
as a citizen, though, I don't focus on it as well as I should. And I'm a pretty informed kind of person. Is it publicized enough? Is it public enough?
That's a fair question. I mean, I think sometimes it's only if it directly impacts you that you do pay attention. So I think I'd certainly, in terms of the projects I've been involved in, the communities around the project will often be very focused on it. The elected officials for that project will be very, very focused on it. I mean, we spend almost as much time thinking about the communication strategy and the communication plan as we do some of the more technical and operational aspects. But I think it really leads to another point that Rick referred to earlier. You know, the folks that are directly impacted may really care about it, and they may be pretty negative about it. How do you sometimes engage those outside who may benefit from the project but may not be, directly involved? And they are the ones that are sometimes harder to reach. And I think you make a good point that it's hard to get those folks sometimes to pay attention.
And so you guys actually put a rating on this stuff.
Yes, so we look at the progress of construction, for example, continuously. We'll be focusing on, is it on time? Are there delays? Are there construction issues? And if we think if a committee thinks that there are serious enough issues that could cause a problem, we will be alerting investors, and that's one of the key aspects of our role in providing transparency around these transactions.
And globally, what percentage of the projects that you rate and observe and worry about get into trouble?
Well, it's really interesting you asked that question, because we put out a study a couple of weeks ago of 25 years of infrastructure asset performance globally, so around 2,300 projects. And what we call the cumulative default rate over 10 years for infrastructure, for PPPs, if we just take that sort of triple B category, which is where PPPs generally sit, was about 1.8%. which is about half of what you would see in a general non-financial corporate credit. And I think that that is indicative of the fact that when you look at infrastructure, it generally tends to be an essential asset, which it's generally set up in such a way that there's a special purpose entity and there are certain protections around how the whole structure is put together from a contractual perspective, from a liquidity perspective, from an operational perspective. You know, we look at the sponsors, we look at the counterparties, and because you've also got generally stable cash flows as an asset class, this is an asset class which is, for these reasons, quite attractive to private capital, both on the debt and equity side.
Jane, and how often do you get into a project and rework a project or step into a project that's all gone off track? Is that something you guys do?
We generally don't do that. We take on new projects. And I have to say, one of the reasons that we work pretty closely with the unions, and most of the union groups that we work with like the notion of greenfields, that is new projects, because those are jobs that are going to happen and occur very quickly. So we tend to take on new projects. We have not, as of yet, stepped into any project that has been in trouble. Unfortunately, ours have not been. So,
Rick, you were going to say something?
I was just going to come back actually to a point that you and Jane were talking about, which is if you talk about transparency, focusing, it is really a different question in terms of the local community and a broader question of how the project is going. And a way to create problems for a project is to fall down on transparency with respect to the local community. And I have to say, you relearn this lesson with every project, and you never do enough. But we have now learned you have to have, before there's close to a shovel in the ground, you have to have an office in the community, you have to have staff in the community, you have to be going almost literally door to door in terms of telling the community what's going to happen, how it's going to happen, how you're going to mitigate, how you're going to offset the impacts you're going to have. So the transparency question in that respect, Alan, I would say is if you don't do it, you're going to put the project truly in jeopardy. And you need to think in your mind you're going to overdo it. The community will always perceive it as not enough.
and it's through the life of the project.
Totally.
Yes.
Just
Totally.
right.
Totally.
And
Do you think that if you surveyed, and then I'll get off this way, if you surveyed the public and said to the public, how are these guys doing at building this stuff? Is it on time? Is it on budget? Is it being done properly? Versus the reality, because we've heard that the projects all get done. Mostly the stuff lately has been getting done pretty good. Do you think there's a mismatch between public perception and the reality? And if so, how can we help it?
we actually a couple of years ago we did a study which actually included LaGuardia of 9 projects that were in various stages of procurement and construction. And it was about a year before the federal election. And we asked people in local communities what they thought about the projects and whether they were positive about them. And it was very interesting because on a ratio of about 9-1, people were positive or very positive about these projects. And I think what they were able to see is that there is a real link between good infrastructure and jobs and economic development in their area. And it was quite interesting because I think the perception around at that time was, communities are really, quite negative about new infrastructure, and this, albeit limited study, showed us something quite different. And I think it comes back to Rick and Jane's point, which is if you can communicate effectively with the community what are the benefits of this infrastructure project, and in terms of their daily lives, their amenities in their local area, potentially the value of their homes, they really do understand that impact.
Right. I've always been interested, I don't know whether it's an interesting question for everybody, but I've always been interested in those infrastructure projects that nobody's ever thought of. and that somehow need to get built. And in New York City, I guess we've opened up, Rick, it's not a project you've done, but a project, we've opened up a new water tunnel that nobody knew we needed, it's just been one of those kinds of sponsorless things. What's your take on the kind of portfolio of projects that you have, and are there projects that have less sponsorship, natural political sponsorship, but you think need to be done anyway?
Well, it's a big challenge. The most obvious example of it is that the Port Authority capital plan, which has $32 billion worth of projects, half of that $32 billion goes to what the business or the industry calls state of good repair. And so of all the things that are unexciting from a political point of view, it is maintenance. It's hard to get up in front of a crowd and be inspiring about maintenance. On the other hand, if you look at our legacy infrastructure, what LaGuardia was, the subways are obviously the most visible symbol of it. If you don't pay attention to maintenance, particularly with legacy systems, you get into real trouble. So the water, I think take a big step. This is a city project. Probably the most extraordinary contributor to New York City's evolution over 100 or 150 years has been its water supply,
yes,
which comes from upstate New York, and it is truly an engineering marvel, but it is invisible. You don't see it, and it is hard to be a champion of it. But if you take those just as two examples, the reality is it takes leadership. And I think that is one thing that you simply learn about this area, which is we started out talking about champions. It takes real leadership, it takes courage, and it takes the willingness to sponsor, to champion, to allocate funds for things for which ultimately, as a leader, whether it's appointed or elected, you are not going to get a lot of credit for it, but the public good will benefit. And so it's an intangible, but I'm not sure there's a better answer to that. You have to lead, you have to persuade people.
Right. So Jane, you at one point in your life said grace over a pretty big infrastructure area called the aviation world in the United States. And that was a subject where there's been a lot of talk about the state of good repair of that system or the technology related to that. What's your sense of this sponsorless, if you will, or invisible project?
I think it's one of the biggest challenges we face. When you look at the state of good repair, it's very hard to get people excited about a maintenance budget. First job I ever had in transportation, I was the Associate Commissioner for Maintenance in Massachusetts. That was not an easy job.
Didn't hold you back.
Didn't hold me back.
You've done fine.
Yeah. But I think part of the message has to be what's the cost of not doing something? And sometimes maybe that's part of the message that we have to convey. What's the cost of not doing something? I do think there could be an opportunity in a new federal legislation. I'd love to see the federal government set in place incentives for long-term life cycle maintenance. I think that would really be something that I think could be a real encouragement to sort of invest where it needs to be invested in some of these maintenance issues. In terms of the aviation system, certainly in terms of new technologies, huge challenge. And one of the biggest challenges, again, is getting the various airlines to coalesce around an agenda and a list of priorities that are important to them. It takes constant pressure and constant vigilance, I would say.
I can imagine. Outside of the United States, is it easier to get involvement in one of these kinds of projects, or is it the same?
I think the sponsorship issue is consistent, a globally consistent issue, and having this problem around approvals and permitting going through multiple political cycles is something that we see everywhere around the world. But just to pick up on the previous point about sponsorship and sustainability, I think the other really interesting emerging interest we're seeing globally, but particularly from Europe and to some extent Asia Pac, is investors are really interested in sustainability. So we're seeing the emergence of a green bond market. We have released around 26 billion of certified green evaluations over the last 12 months. And one of the areas that is covered in this is resilience spending. And it does seem to me that there is actually quite a lot of resilience spending that is going on in the US in municipalities at the moment that is not necessarily being recognised by the investor community. And so it's a different form of sponsorship, if you like, but it's certainly something that's emerging, and it's part of this whole focus on ESG, which, you know, is really saying, you know, how sustainable is this investment going to be over the longer term?
And by the way, I would add that with P3s, there's a real incentive for us, for example, at LaGuardia, to really think forward. We're going to be there for a long time, over 35 years. So you want to put, for example, heating systems in place that really will be state-of-the-art, be sustainable, and be able to get through that long period.
So let me change it up again one more time in the time we have available. So the two of you, and I'm looking at you, and then you're the referee. The two of you are negotiating a deal to build LaGuardia Airport. Private sector, public sector. How did the negotiation go? What's important to you? What's important to you? How do you work it out?
Well, what's important if you take the public-private partnership that got negotiated, the public policy goals first, front and center, was construction time, construction quality, and a fixed price. So that's the front end. And the financial negotiation is probably clear, more, less. But the other pieces, even there, are we insisted, the Port Authority, I was not there at the time, but I was in the governor's office, was design build, that is how construction gets done, which is a fixed price, both the design and the construction being done by a consortium, so that from the government's point of view, there doesn't wind up between finger pointing where the government has bought a design from one company and buys the construction from another, and then you wind up with the government refereeing fingers pointing between the construction company saying can't build that design, the design company saying the construction company doesn't know what it's doing. So design build, clear schedule, fixed price. The operate and maintain is a bit of a dialogue, which is, again, the financial being that the private operator gets control of certain revenue streams, which, by the way, will be more if they do a good job in terms of operating and maintaining, and the public sector wants them focused on that. So we want them to put up capital, which takes some of the pressure off of the public agency, but we want to be sure that in return for that they have both their incentive, which is to attract more customers, drive more business, but that we're setting serious performance standards. So the negotiation becomes obviously over the dollars, but what are the standards? Dialogue back and forth. What is who bears the financial risk in terms of any improvements that need to come over time? But one tries from the public agency point of view, again, to get that private sector expertise into the design and construction, and then the private sector expertise into the operation and maintenance, and being sure that it's high standards and leaving the incentives that drive the private sector in a positive way to incentivize performance that will drive customers and therefore revenues in their direction.
So you want less, you want a date, and you want to be not bothered.
Well, no, it's very simple. We want to pay less money. We want very high standards,
And
and
you
we
want
want
a date
the
certain.
responsibility on the
Right.
private sector.
Okay, so you're
Right.
on the other side of that train.
Actually, I think Rick started with the most important point, which is a clear statement of what the public sector wants. That's really what we need to understand. What is the public policy goal here that we're all working for? And Susan talked about alignment of interest. It's in those early conversations that you're aligning those interests. What's your public policy goals? How can we achieve them? The other point I would make, and Rick talked about lots of dialogue and communication. To me, the best part of the procurement process for LaGuardia, and I've not seen it always replicated, I will say, during that whole procurement process, there was a great deal of back and forth. So that when we brought forward ideas on design that may have been quite different, and in fact they were, from where the port was, we had an opportunity to talk about it, they could react to it. So that's really important as well. But really, it's that getting back to that alignment of interest and very clear public policy goals.
Now, how did you get comfortable with a fixed price and a fixed date with a, if you will, a counterparty that has been known over the years to be fickle, to be complex, and change a lot? I didn't mean to criticize, but I'm just making an argument.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I think it's the communication. We are in constant communication.
But you had to sign a contract, and you signed
We
it.
signed the contract, and we have a contractor who looked at that fixed price very, very carefully and did not sign, wouldn't sign easily. So
Great.
it takes a lot of analysis on his part to make sure that they're comfortable with it.
Now, do you, Susan, when you look at a project, do you try to evaluate what they've all signed?
Yes. So we'll look at the contracts, we'll look at the price, we'll break down the price, we'll talk to the engineers and the technical advisors, and we'll work out what can go wrong and has it been mitigated, and we'll go through all the contractual conditions and the financial arrangements. Is there enough liquidity? We'll run a downside. We'll look at delays. We'll look at the passenger numbers and the passenger forecasts and run a downside on that. We'll go through all the costs and how they're going to how they change over time. We'll look at how much the contractor has, the contractor and subcontractors' experience in carrying out the same project in similar situations elsewhere. We'll look at all the permits and approvals and essentially form a view.
Well, thank you all. We've got only a minute or two to go. Any final thoughts, Rick, or anybody?
Well, I think my comment would simply be infrastructure has become a highly discussed focal point of public dialogue. I think that's all to the good. These are very, very difficult projects to get going, keep going, sustain interest and support for. Public commentary helps. I actually think at the national level, one of the really unfortunate developments over the last year or so has been the failure of the federal government to step up to serious infrastructure support. That was talked about as hopefully a nonpartisan, across party lines agenda. It obviously hasn't materialized, but that's why for states and localities, we have to step up and really just push these projects forward.
Right.
I would just
Do you
say-
think you're going to get a national plan?
I think it is unlikely that we will get a national plan that will satisfy everything that we would like to see accomplished. I think we'll get something, which is why, and Rick has ended on a good note, which is local communities, municipalities, city mayors, governors, they're the folks now who are really stepping to the plate, much more than the federal government. I think when I started in infrastructure, it was really mostly a federal program, but this has become much more local, and we really need and look to the leadership at the local level, which has been terrific, I think.
Well, you guys have been terrific. I want to thank you all, and I hope we answered a couple of questions, and I just thank you all for taking the time today to do this.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks, everybody.